My name is Teki Sarantakis. It is my great honor to welcome you to the 2024 Jocelyn Burgon Visiting Scholar Lecture at the Canada School of Public Service. This year's lecture is being given by Professor Jonathan Kraft from the University of Toronto. Professor Kraft is one of the bright lights in the Canadian public policy and Canadian public administration spaces, and he has spent the last little while examining this thing we call the policy community within the Government of Canada. And policy is tremendously important to all of our lives because policy determines what we can do, what we can't do, what laws are passed, what regulations are passed. And it is critically important that the policy function within the federal government and within other governments has tremendous capacity to be able to deal with society's issues. After Professor Kraft finishes his lecture, we will have a little panel discussion to talk about some of the key things that he's raised. Professor Kraft.
Hello. I'm Dr. Jonathan Kraft, Associate Professor of Comparative Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Je suis également honoré de servir comme le chercheur invité Jocelyn Burgon à l'École de la fonction publique du gouvernement du Canada pour l'année 2023-24. J'aimerais commencer tout d'abord par remercier le leadership de l'école et l'équipe qui m'ont appuyé. Ils ont démontré les meilleures qualités et compétences de la fonction publique. I'm often struck by how little time we spend as a country and as a scholarly community discussing our public service and the state of Canadian public administration. I would argue that this is because it largely works. Of course, I recognize, like we all do, that there are times when it falls short, and that's often when we talk about the public service. But for many, it's an institution that can easily be taken for granted. The Government of Canada is the nation's largest employer and has an annual budget in the hundreds of billions of dollars. More importantly, it's the institution that, in concert with our democratically elected representatives, creates and administers key programs and supports to ensure that Canadians thrive. It deserves scrutiny and analysis, but also support to ensure that it is effective. My talk today is therefore focused on questions of capacity to make effective public policy and the need to modernize policymaking practices. I'll flag core challenges to strengthening Canada's policy capacity. These challenges, in my view, are linked to the way the public service is organized, how the public service has sought to generate and sustain its policy capacity, and of course, the changing nature of policymaking itself. Le discours d'aujourd'hui reflète mes propres opinions, mais il est également éclairé par une décennie de recherche portant sur des questions de conseil de conception de politique, de la capacité de politique, ainsi que des questions de réforme du secteur public. Je conclurai en fournissant 5 recommandations qui sont des options pratiques et réalisables. Researchers in Canada and elsewhere have been studying various challenges to effective public policy making. To name a few, a growing emphasis on short-termism or issues management in policymaking, the pernicious gap between policy design and implementation, or the disconnect between policy intent and what actually is delivered and outcomes. To be sure, these and other big challenges are being experienced by public services around the world. However, by international comparisons, Canada's public service and governments of various stripes have been much less active on matters of public service reform, particularly compared to Canada's Westminster-style cousins of Australia, Britain, and New Zealand, where regular reforms and attempts to modernize policymaking have been clearer and more sustained. To be sure, there are excellent pockets of modernization and renewal in the federal public service. I will point to those in a moment. Canada's approach has, however, emphasized what scholars would call the individual dimension of policy capacity, recruiting talented policy thinkers and doers. While this is undoubtedly a key ingredient to effective government, Canada's challenge is a structural one, linked to organizational forms of policy capacity. That is, in the ability of the public service to effectively coordinate and deploy its policy resources, and to ensure adequate mechanisms for organizational learning, human resources management. These challenges can best be addressed, I argue, through the adoption of a more robust stewardship approach in Canada. Stewardship is a duty of proactive care for a resource, which can include people, information, processes, and institutions. Stewardship is interpreted and applied in different ways in various jurisdictions, of course. In Canada, it's already one of the 5 core values in the Public Service Code of Values and Ethics. Indeed, the current clerk of the Privy Council has launched an important conversation about those core public service values. This is an excellent opportunity to revisit the stewardship value, to have a discussion about what stewardship means for Canada's public service today, and to look for opportunities to strengthen and modernize that value for policymaking. Of course, adapting a more robust stewardship approach involves more than just language or statements of ethics. In this talk, I'll provide 5 key recommendations for organizational changes and reforms. These include creating a standalone, Deputy Secretary level led Public Service Modernization Unit in the Privy Council office to drive and better coordinate public service renewal and policy capacity. Second, mandating reviews of existing policy capacity within the public service every 2 years. Third, expanding and deepening the clerk's report on the state of the public service. Fourth, through Canada's Policy Community Initiative, the public service must develop clearer and well-communicated policy practices and principles. What does modern policymaking look like, and how should it be done? And these must be linked to reforms to ensure key processes which enable and require them in the lived experiences of public servants. Lastly, the public service needs to develop an enterprise-wide or whole-of-government approach to developing existing policy staff's training and competencies. Il s'agit des réformes concrètes et des opportunités qui, comme je le montrais, sont fondées sur ce qui a fonctionné dans la pratique canadienne et internationale. Cependant, et surtout, ces opportunités doivent être ancrées dans un changement plus large vers une approche d'intendance. Une approche qui reconnaît les obligations et les responsabilités uniques de la fonction publique à garantir de manière proactive qu'elle dispose de la capacité de politique nécessaire pour bien servir les gouvernements et les Canadiens. So what is policy capacity? Why do we need it? And why is it under threat? Policy capacity is an essential element for effective governing. It is the set of skills and competencies and resources across government agencies to design and pursue policy goals. Researchers have noted that it consists of individual, organizational, and system-level dimensions. These speak to the skills and competencies of individual staff, the way the organization of the public service as a whole can manage and coordinate its policy capacity and do the work of policy, and broader systems-level considerations linked to state-society relations and the global context. The consensus in Canada and elsewhere is that the public service's policy capacity has declined or become less effective than in the past. Specifically, these involve concerns about the research, analytical, and advisory skills and abilities of the public service, shortages in public service policy talent, including churn of staff, over-reliance on outside consultants, and underinvestment in public service training, weak systems for prioritization, collaboration, and policy coherence owing to silos in the public service. Others have long emphasized that capacity gaps manifest themselves in the lack of the ability of the public service to implement successfully. That public services lack policy capacity to implement and achieve desired outcomes. That the line of sight between policy formulation and implementation is increasingly obscured. And that the public service's ability to mobilize and coordinate around whole-of-government priorities and issues is now challenged. Again, these are issues that are regularly discussed by international scholars and those in governing circles, not just here in Ottawa, but in Canberra, Australia, Wellington, New Zealand, and London, England, too. These challenges are not new, and neither are attempts by governments to deal with them. The Government of Canada has long been interested in questions of policy capacity. Work in the mid-1990s, spurred by then-clerk Justin Bourgon, recognized that there was a need to take stock of existing capacity and ensure that the public service had the right kinds of capacity and in the right corners of government. Sous la direction du statisticien en chef du Canada de l'époque, à la tête d'un groupe de travail de niveau sous-ministériel et en collaboration avec des chercheurs universitaires, ils ont identifié les principaux défis de la capacité de politique de la fonction publique et les moyens d'y remédier. Leur rapport a mis l'emphase sur 5 thèmes. Premièrement, le besoin contenu de services d'élaboration des politiques de qualité afin de relever les grands défis lancés au gouvernement. Deuxièmement, le besoin d'accorder plus d'attention à la gestion et aux méthodes de travail sur les politiques, tant au niveau ministériel qu'interministériel. Le besoin de se pencher davantage sur les questions stratégiques et à plus long terme, y compris les grands enjeux fonctionnels communs à plusieurs ministères et l'amélioration des tribunes interministérielles où sont traitées ces questions. Le besoin de tenir compte des ressources et des contributions externes en matière de politique comme complément aux services internes du gouvernement. Et dernièrement, l'importance du leadership que doivent assumer les plus hauts fonctionnaires en vue de répondre à ces besoins. What's striking is how relevant these themes remain. The need for capacity to respond to pressing policy challenges, recognition of a diversity of policy techniques and practices, the need for strategic and long-term policy thinking, coordination, and horizontal policymaking, and optimization of internal and external capacity and senior leadership. These themes endure because they reflect the very essence and the greatest challenges of policymaking, avoiding being captured by the urgent at the expense of the important. Failing to think and act strategically and to develop effective ways of coordination in a public administration system that is complex and rules-based. Part of the challenge also rests with the fact that the nature of policy work has itself evolved since the task force looked at those issues some 30 years ago. Public service institutions and key policy-making processes were designed in and for another era. Indeed, they've struggled under the weight of the pace, demands, and complexities of today's policymaking and its issues. Scholarly research over the last 15 years, including my own, has provided us with an excellent grasp of how policy now gets done and where capacity is strongest and weakest in Canada. We know that there have been a trend towards firefighting or short-termism in policy work. Evidence is also clear that there's been a shift towards process-heavy forms of generalism in the Canadian federal public service. This is a departure from a more substantive and experience-based capacity developed by policy staff remaining in the same departments for prolonged periods of time. We know that there's a tendency towards internalism, that much consultation and engagement activity is undertaken amongst public servants within the Government of Canada itself and with other orders of government. This is in addition to the engagement that happens with Canadians and with key constituencies in the private, nonprofit, and international sectors. The Canadian Public Service has, over the years, sought to address these challenges. The recruitment of policy leaders and advanced policy analyst initiatives have been successful and important. These were in fact suggested, in principle, in the recommendations of the 1996 Policy Capacity Report. Aujourd'hui, plusieurs dans les rangs moyens à supérieurs dans la fonction publique sont des recrues du programme RLP. C'est un atout. Le programme PAAP a démontré l'efficacité des approches rotationnelles pour faire passer les nouvelles recrues titulaires de diplômes avancés par les ministères sectoriels et les agences centrales afin d'acquérir l'expérience en matière de politique. Cependant, ces programmes, par leur conception, ne recrutent qu'un nombre limité de professionnels de haut calibre en matière de politique. In the last 5 years, only approximately 180 new hires have joined the public service through these two streams. By comparison, the EC category, the economics and social science staff, which is the traditional category of policy staff here in Ottawa, has grown from over just 12,000 in 2009 to 23,000 as of 2023. While not a perfect measure of public service policy capacity, given the work done by executives, program staff, and other types of public servants, it's not clear that planning or strategic thinking at the whole of government level was brought to bear on how this EC capacity was onboarded or how it can be best deployed in government. To be frank, in undertaking my research, I had to request raw data on the distribution of EC staff by department and seniority over time, and then complete the analysis with a graduate student. The government didn't have it on hand, and it should, along with analysis that looks at cognate categories of staff and a range of other issues. Upon analysis of just that EC category, it was clear that there's been some big changes. Not only overall growth, but changes in where EC staff are allocated in government, a significant increase in the seniority of the EC staffing category as a whole, and more ECs doing managerial types of policy work. Well, what are the impacts of these changes? How is the government dealing with these key trends in its key set of policy staff? De même, les différents ministères ont souvent des initiatives de gestion et de développement des talents. Cependant, ces initiatives sont ad hoc et semblent dépendre des ressources et de l'intérêt des gestionnaires et des dirigeants. Nous ne le savons pas vraiment, car le gouvernement ne dispose pas d'une coordination à l'échelle de l'entreprise et les recherches sont limitées. This is just an illustration of the broader point. The public service needs to get serious about understanding its own policy capacity and adopt a more active stewardship approach to nurturing and deploying that capacity. Passant du niveau individuel à la dimension de capacité organisationnelle est regardée à l'initiative de la communauté des politiques. Lancée par le Bureau du Conseil privé en 2017, elle a cherché à rassembler les professionnels des politiques à Ottawa et à développer des ressources pour ceux qui s'identifient comme professionnels des politiques. Moi, j'ai assisté à ces événements dans le passé et je sais qu'ils sont de haute qualité. Cependant, mes recherches ont été claires et critiques. Comparée aux références internationales, elle est sous-développée. While it's focused on convening a yearly conference and managing a small cross-mobility functional group within government, these have both been quite limited in scale. I want to be clear. My view is that its underperformance, benchmarked to other jurisdictions, is tied to a lack of ambition in its mandate and a lack of stewardship to ensure that the policy community is adequately resourced and supported. The current resourcing of approximately $1 million a year and a dozen full-time staff equivalents are an indication this is not being taken as seriously as it should. The British policy profession, for instance, is funded at just over £3 million a year with a staff of 40. It does much more, but it has the resources to do so. I've been pleased to learn in conversations with many in Ottawa that there is an appetite to do more. The signals are positive. However, it remains unclear if the mandate of the policy community is sufficient in scope and scale to serve as a system-wide catalyst, if its linkages to senior decision-making tables are sufficient to provide the needed traction to mobilize reforms and capacity building at a systems level. Looking to other countries, we can see other approaches and opportunities for Canada to draw from. The United Kingdom has a long-standing policy profession unit with standards for policy professionals and a policy curriculum. Australia has a Delivering Great Policy program located in the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet that has recently been relaunched, building on previous initiatives. New Zealand has taken arguably the most comprehensive approach through the Policy Project out of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. A core output produced by most of these initiatives is policy improvement frameworks that serve as the foundation of their work. For example, New Zealand's policy skills, policy quality, and policy capability frameworks, or Australia's model of delivering great policy, and the UK's policy profession standards. These are currently lacking in Canada. We simply do not have comparable tools in place. I know that the Canada School of Public Service has just launched some policy analyst learning resources, and the policy community has just recently launched an adaptable policy framework. This is an excellent start. Mais en comparaison, la Nouvelle-Zélande a réalisé le plus grand investissement compte tenu de la taille de sa fonction publique et le nombre relativement plus petit du personnel spécifiquement dédié aux politiques. Alors qu'au Canada, il y a un investissement beaucoup plus faible et un champ d'activité plus limité. Par contre, le Canada dispose néanmoins d'une fonction publique comparativement plus grande et d'un plus grand nombre de personnel formellement spécialisé dans les politiques. The New Zealand and British initiatives have also been subject to more regular and formal reviews, which is helpful to identify what's working and where new strategies or investments may help. These jurisdictions use reviews all the time regarding the general state of policymaking, capacity within the public service, and policy modernization efforts. This is something that Canada simply does not do enough of either. Whether you favor a comprehensive and lengthy Royal Commission on the state of the public service, or a shorter task force or blue ribbon panel, Canada is doing little of either. Like a good family doctor, regular checkups and full physicals at appropriate intervals are helpful to identify problems and take stock of one's health. Indeed, the Task Force on Policy Capacity in the 1990s was a clarion call that led to meaningful and important initiatives and policy reforms. So how do we get there? How can we foster a more robust stewardship approach for policy practice? The good news is that stewardship is already a value in the Canadian public service. In Canada, this value means, I quote, "Federal public servants are entrusted to use and care for public resources responsibly for both the short term and long term." Indeed, the code further specifies linked behaviors, including, I quote, "effectively and efficiently using public money, property, and resources, considering the present and long-term effects that their actions have on people and the environment, acquiring, preserving, and sharing knowledge and information as appropriate." These are excellent, but they do not speak to the need for proactive care of the institution of the public service or for sufficient policy capacity renewal. In New Zealand's public service, stewardship means something different. According to the government, and I quote, "Stewardship requires taking active steps rather than a responsive or passive approach. Public servants uphold the principle of stewardship by contributing to processes within their department that ensure that people, information, processes, and assets of the public service are appropriately developed and maintained, and that ministers receive advice that supports them to be good stewards." This is a more comprehensive approach that identifies the need to be proactive and nurture the capacity of the public service to support ministers, cabinet, and ultimately to serve citizens. The big challenge for Canada is that it lacks a clearly accountable and sufficiently resourced hub to drive and manage policy renewal and capacity building, to drive a stewardship approach. At present, there's a deputy minister level committee, the Board of Management and Renewal, chaired by the clerk, mandated to advance the management agenda and the renewal of the public service. There's a Treasury Board Secretariat Public Service Management Advisory Committee, mandated to provide a forum for consultation, collaboration, and discussion on the public service management issues. These are useful tables for senior executives to discuss issues, but they meet irregularly and have not fostered a coherent or ambitious policy capacity building or policy modernization experience for the public service. Canada's Clerk of the Privy Council, and by this I mean the institution, not any one individual in the role, is heavily oversubscribed. The role includes them serving as Secretary to Cabinet, Deputy Minister to the Prime Minister, and also the statutory head of the public service. No one should be surprised that roles 1 and 2 have trumped roles 3 for most. Supporting a government in managing the day-to-day of public service clearly crowds out the longer-term thinking and positioning to build policy capacity and ensure policy practices are fit for purpose. Indeed, in other Westminster jurisdictions, the function of the head of the public service, with responsibility for renewal, is often handled by a separate institution. A public service commissioner or a public service commission, or is clearly led by a second, very senior official working from the center of government. There's a clear need in Canada for reform, and my first recommendation is to create a standalone deputy clerk position and modernization unit within the Privy Council office. This should drive and coordinate public service reform, including policy capacity building and modernization. Organizationally, the current model sees senior appointments and public service renewal combined at PCO. I argue that this underserves the important public service renewal agenda in Canada. A deputy clerk and policy modernization unit should have a clear mandate to lead renewal work, which should include oversight and enablement of the policy community initiative. The policy community was initially launched out of the Privy Council and has since bounced around to a few departments, but still reports to the clerk. In my view, for it to be effective, it needs that enterprise-wide line of sight and stronger institutional support from the center and senior management tables. This comes from being at PCO and with the support of a new, dedicated public service renewal deputy clerk. I appreciate that there are benefits to rotating the policy community initiative to departments. This could still be accomplished through a rotating departmental DM or ADM champion. However, as keeper of cabinet decision-making processes, including memorandums to cabinet, and with its whole of government line of sight and machinery of government authorities, housing the policy community in PCO makes more sense, particularly as it needs to be linked to broader modernization and reform efforts across government. En effet, la plupart des initiatives similaires dans d'autres juridictions sont encore gérées par le centre du gouvernement ou fortement soutenues par celui-ci. Le nouveau rôle du sous-secrétaire du bureau du conseil privé et de la communauté des politiques devrait faire l'objet des revues formelles régulières, non seulement pour s'assurer qu'ils atteignent leur mandat, mais aussi pour identifier les opportunités pour les renforcer et les soutenir davantage. Ceci est lié à ma deuxième recommandation clé. As noted already, regular and serious reviews of policy capacity and capability are standard practice in other jurisdictions. At present, there is no public service baseline and very little data to provide an effective grasp of who's in the Canadian policy community, where is capacity located or missing, and how best to target modernization efforts. The reform unit and new deputy clerk that I'm proposing should be mandated to coordinate regular reviews of policy capacity. These reviews should be facilitated by the policy community, but also the Treasury Board Secretariat Committee on Management and Reform. This is another management table that could be more actively playing a role in policy and capacity modernization. Treasury Board Secretariat supports the formal employer in the Government of Canada, and it also has ownership of key government-wide internal policy suites that are consequential for how policy work gets done. No one wants a review for the sake of review, and that's certainly not what I'm advocating. These stock takes should be data-driven and evidence-informed, opportunities that are clearly designed to improve self-awareness of where policy capacity is located and where gaps persist. They should be catalysts to actively align rules and internal policy to institutionalize modern policymaking practices. There's also a need to get a better handle on internal talent management and development programs. The Treasury Board Secretariat, working with the Privy Council Office and the Policy Community Initiative, should study and work on developing a whole-of-government talent management and policy development initiative. What are the suites of internal applicable policy? How are various existing departmental initiatives working? Where can coherence and scaling up be explored? There are, of course, many models that this could adopt and take, but the above point on the number of EC staff versus RPL and APA recruits suggests a strong need to work on managing and developing talent already in the system and in a coordinated fashion across the entire public service. This is particularly important given the greater movement of policy staff from department to department, and also the seemingly more senior types of policy staff in the EC category. My fourth recommendation takes us back to reporting and back to the clerk. Section 126 of the Public Service Employment Act states in one sentence that the clerk is the head of the public service, and in the next section requires them to submit a yearly report to the Prime Minister to be tabled in both houses of Parliament. Les rapports ont pris de nombreuses formes et formats. Ils sont utilisés de manière assez efficace pour communiquer le travail formidable accompli par la fonction publique. Ceci est important, mais il existe des opportunités claires pour que ce rapport mette également en lumière les domaines qui nécessitent plus d'attention. Un rapport similaire du Commission de la fonction publique australienne, qui détient cette obligation statutaire en Australie, comptait environ 220 pages en 2023. It's clear that there is a runway for a more ambitious clerk's report. In an ideal world, the legislation I mentioned would be amended to be clear about the expectations and obligations of Canada's head of the public service, to legislate a stewardship role. I also support others who've called for a more active public service reporting to Parliament through the clerk or their designate. It's time for that conversation too, about the role of Parliament in ensuring an effective and sufficiently resourced public service. My final recommendation returns to policy as practice. Through the Policy Community Initiative and my proposal for a new PCO deputy clerk, the public service should develop clear and well-communicated policy-making playbooks and practices. These are well established in other jurisdictions and are important tools to help set expectations and guide public servants towards modernizing policy practices. There's been a widespread recognition of the failings of the traditional waterfall-like policy process. That is the long, drawn-out process where policy is developed in a way that's disconnected from operational contexts, data, and experiences. A move to test and learn or more iterative approaches is now being put in place in other jurisdictions, in some pockets of the Canadian public service too. Research for my current book on policy modernization and digital government has revealed through interviews with officials across these Westminster-style governments that Canada is much further behind in adopting these test and learn approaches. Attempts to institutionalize these practices, such as via the digital standards, have been voluntary, not mandatory. They're nice to haves, not it must work this way. The proposed PCO Reform Hub and a deputy clerk working with the policy community and TBS Management Reform Committee would be well placed to tackle this issue. The UK policy profession and the New Zealand policy project, they've developed similar instruments. Are they perfect? No. However, the seeds of policy modernization have been planted, and stewardship approaches are ensuring that they're being nurtured. However, for this to become concrete, the policy community, empowered by a PCO deputy clerk leading a reform hub, must take a hard look, at departmental level and whole of government policy processes. Briefing notes, policy development processes, and the relationship between memorandums to cabinet, Treasury Board submissions, budget, these can all be reviewed and modernized. This should involve collaborative work with departments and units across the public service, as well as central agencies. This will ensure to reflect the best practices that are essential to delivering policies that work on the ground and meet their policy intent. Where data and operationally informed test and learn policymaking is the norm, not a nice to have. The integration of GBA Plus analysis and the adoption of a climate change lens are examples that this type of change can be done, and it can lead to stronger policymaking. Without catastrophizing or wearing too rosy of glasses, I think there are some practical options to move towards a more robust stewardship approach in Canada. In closing, let me draw out a few themes. The first and arguably the most important is that institutions matter. The Canadian public service needs to embed modernization and policy capacity within its institutions, notably the central leadership of the public service, but also fostering it in departments too. Le Canada a une bonne fondation et dispose d'excellents programmes de recrutement, d'une initiative de communauté de politique, et je pense qu'il y a une bonne volonté au sein du système pour la réforme. Cependant, une plus grande cohérence systématique est nécessaire pour coordonner et intégrer les différentes initiatives de réforme et d'amélioration des politiques. The reforms I've suggested here are practical and leverage a whole-of-government approach, while linking policy capacity and practice modernization to key decision-making tables and accountability structures. Reforms to key policy-making processes and practices are needed to ensure that operationally informed, data-rich, user-centered, and test and learn styles of policy are put in place, but also that the public service has the capacity to undertake them. With all this uncertainty and the challenges in our world today, the public service remains a crucial institution. It's time to move towards a more robust model of stewardship. to ensure Canada's public service remains fit for purpose. Merci. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you for providing the 2024 lecture. Now, as a visiting scholar, you're kind of a little bit of a zoologist. You come in somewhere, you walk amongst us, you observe, and then you report. I'll let you in on a little secret. The biggest angst in Ottawa right now isn't policy, it's delivery. Mm-hmm. So when I started in the government 27 years ago, the biggest angst actually was policy. It was, as you mentioned, one of the tables. It was after program review, Madame Bergon, who was clerk at the time and whose lecture you were speaking under the auspices of, really was worried that program review had eliminated a lot of the policy capacity in the government of Canada. And policy, I just want to, as your professor, I want to start with a definition. What is policy? Because there are a lot of people in Ottawa that work in policy. Mm-hmm. And if you ask them to define policy, they'll kind of go, well, I don't know.
Yeah. I think, first of all, thanks for the invitation to deliver the lecture. And I think I've got a season's pass to the zoo because as a Canadian public administration scholar, I'm in Ottawa all the time. And as a public policy scholar and enthusiast, I'm constantly engaging with public servants. And I think I would reject the premise that delivery and policy are two different things. I think that's actually kind of one of the points I was trying to get across in my lecture at the end was around the need to close the false gap between delivery and implementation as a discrete activity that's disconnected from how you make policy. Policy for some is conceived of as this exercise where you identify options and you provide those to decision makers who decide what to do, and then somebody throws it over the fence to public servants to implement on the ground. And I think that's not ever. I don't think that's ever really been the case. I think it's a bit of a false construct. And so I think the big challenge is really around how do you think of policy as a spectrum that involves the agenda setting and formulation activities of determining options and feasibility and matching instruments with policy goals, all the way through to, well, how do you actually do this? If you don't have a conversation about how to implement something, then your policy is never going to be successful. And I think that governments are really wrestling with this challenge to kind of come at that. And to answer your question, because you asked me a very specific question, I always start my policy classes with a slide that has 4 or 5 different definitions of policy. But I think the most parsimonious and the easiest to remember is policy is whatever a government chooses to do or not to. And that's a famous definition from the 1970s. But I think that the nature of policy today is more complicated than that. And there are a bunch of different actors and realities. So policy isn't just developing options. It's that whole spectrum of activity from trying to decide what we're going to do about public problems and what is a problem and how to define and structure those problems, all the way through to making sure that people are getting their passports, that people old age security checks are going out, that Canadians can access all the programs and services. So I think that, and policy scholars are partly to blame, I think, for trying to present something that's simpler, a heuristic that allows us to kind of deconstruct that complexity. But I think there's a recognition in governments around the world that we need to kind of tighten up the feedback cycles and the duration between implementation and formulation, because that's all part of policy.
Mm-hmm. I think it is in a kind of a normal human being sense that policy and delivery would be one and the same, because there's really no point in coming up with ideas or schematas or perspectives and putting them forward to decision makers if you can't implement them. But that's not the case I don't think it's the case actually in much of the Western world. If you look at, like, for example, I'm sure you're familiar with Jennifer Palka and her wonderful book, Recoding America. Her fundamental thesis is that a lot of what's wrong with government today is the policy delivery divide. That, going back to the zoo, there's a group of animals in one part of the zoo that are the big thinkers.
They read Plato and Aristotle and scholarly journals, and they come up with the great ideas. And then there's another part of the zoo where at some point when people are done their big brain activities, they say, okay, over to you guys now. You guys deliver what was in our big brain. It's almost analogous to even like a university. Like there are disciplines, even though there's a problem, universities are split up into different disciplines, different problems, different substrata. That's how it is in the federal public service. We have a policy unit and we have a delivery unit or a programs unit. How do those two, sometimes they're in the same floor of the same building.
Right.
They don't talk to each other as much as you would think.
Yeah, and I think Jennifer's book is excellent, but I when I'm reading it, I think about since the 1970s, people have been writing about the formulation implementation gap, or the nexus between what to do about problems and how to actually go about implementing and delivering, as people like to call it today. So I think that problem is not necessarily new, and I think of policy is, for example, let's use border crossing, right? So you have a policy around how border crossing works. Present your documentation. But as any Canadian knows, when you go to the border, they'll ask you questions, and there's a lot of discretion around whether you get pulled over for a further search, or what kinds of questions they ask you, or what that process is like. And I think that the reality is there's a misperception that policy is just, we're going to do X. Oftentimes, X is very broad and very general, and gets given life by staff in programs and operational units that have to figure out, well, what does X mean, and how do I actually deliver those services, or how do I actually get a visitor through our border crossing? So I think those are again, some ways of thinking about policy that need to change. And I think Jennifer and others are rightly pointing to the role of digital and data and other ways that can help give us insights on what's happening on the ground. On your point about the zoo, back to our metaphor, and I quite like that. I think that there's been a recognition that we need to move to multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary teams, where your policy person and your operations or your business or your programs or whatever term you want to call them are working either in the same team, or that there are processes around trying to create more connections and more connective tissues as the policy gets developed. So that's informed by operational realities. And so I think that there are a variety of folks inside government that are trying to do that. But there are huge challenges on the human resources side to actually, in Ottawa speak, get the right boxes with the right people in the right teams. And so I think there are some great initiatives that are happening to build those types of modern teams. But I also think that there is a lot of reform work that can be done to ensure that your ADM of policy and your ADM of operations are working in ways that are coordinated, and ensuring that staff are aware of kind of the issues. Because oftentimes, I think people in big P policy worlds get criticized, but by folks who are implementing and delivering on the ground, saying you don't know what this is like, or you don't realize that when you do it in official languages or with accessibility, it creates these dynamics. Well, I think the arrow goes the other way as well, where sometimes operational folks who are working in a student employment center or working at a passport office don't realize that policy exists because it has to ensure that there's coordination amongst, diplomats traveling with passports, or children's passports and the requirements for pictures, or 5-year versus 10-year. There's all these policies that exist. And so at a policy level, there's a need for coordination. And then below the surface, there's kind of the horizontal and vertical need for coordination. And so I think this is where government is complex and challenging. And I think Canadians and ministers and officials can become frustrated because this is the system that we have. And so I think, it's just so crucial that we're looking at the processes that exist and trying to figure out where are those gaps to provide opportunities to close them, or to do things in new ways, so that policy is seen as that spectrum, and that that zoo is kind of, all healthy and all able to kind of put its best foot forward.
And this isn't necessarily a Canadian angst. This is an angst that goes across many countries in the world. You noted the Westminster system, our cousins in the Commonwealth. But there just across the globe, we have situations where legitimately elected democratic officials have come up with something, whether that is a policy or an idea or a platform, and they have said, now deliver this.
Sure.
And there are missteps in that way. And I think probably the most famous of this is Tony Blair in the UK, and his analogy of, the politicians would pull a lever, but the lever wasn't attached to anything. And so you've hit on something I think that's really important, which is that policy and delivery, even just the very fact of speaking of them as separate entities, right away you've made a mistake. Right away you've made a conceptual error. Is that a kind of an accurate way of representing what you're calling policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I published a paper on what I called low fidelity policy design, which is in essence that instead of kind of trying to come up with big P policy that's perfect, that's gone through and thought about, the business case and the requirements for 3 years and not built and delivered anything and tested it, and then going and implementing that and realizing like it doesn't work, you need to kind of adopt an approach that is, much shorter cycles of developing policy and implementing and testing. That's the test and learn approach that I think is being favored by governments around the world because they're all grappling with the same issue. I think you're right to point that out, and Canada isn't exceptional in this instance. But I think what's driving it is not just politicians who are looking for levers, but it's the pace of policymaking where you need to respond to a COVID, or you need to respond to a natural disaster or a climate change or cost of living issue, whatever the issue du jour is, you want to respond quickly. And the problem is that that's often not possible. There are gains that can be made in efficiencies in the system, but I think what's also important is to have a really sober conversation about the trade-offs. We don't want rushed policy because we want to think about the considerations. We want to think about the implications of things. And so I think there's a bit of a delicate dance that has to happen between trying to be responsive and allow Canadians to see governments and public services there when they need them and responding to our most pressing policy challenges, but also to ensuring that the public service has the time and the capacity and the resources to bring to bear its expert analysis, to go out and find evidence and views from other communities and constituencies, and to stress test as much as possible the policies that they're going to put in place so that when they are put in place, they work. Because I think that, if you want to respond quickly, it also has to work. Fast isn't good enough. It has to be fast and effective. And again, I think this is why it's so challenging to be in public service, because the game is complicated and the stakes are high. And so Canadians and others are depending on the public service to be able to do that. And the public service, it does a great job, but the context in which it delivers policy now is awash in data. Everything is complicated and interconnected. And so I think the public service has processes and institutions and a culture that are well established and have served Canadians well. But they're also causing a bit of pressure in the ability of government to be able to respond to that quick but effective balancing act that it has to undertake.
Now, let me take a perspective from outside the public service, and let me talk about kind of, I think it was in the 90s where we really started to see like the emergence of platforms, where I think the first one actually was, I think it might have been Contract with America from Newt Gingrich, where it was like, here's what we're going to do, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And then I think it was Mike Harris, kind of the common sense, I don't remember what it was called, the common sense revolution or document, but it was like, if elected, we will do this, this, and this, and this. And then again in the 90s, we saw the Red Book at the federal level. And so to me, all of those things, they're kind of policy. They're the government before their government, but the partisan or the political side is saying, if elected, I will do this. I will do this to the GST. I will do this to a free trade accord. I will do that to rents or housing or what have you.
Sure.
It seems to me that that's fundamentally changed the game. And what I mean by that is I think the public service is less and less looked at as the fountainhead for kind of developing the ideas, and more looked at as, I don't really care what you think about the ideas. I was elected on this. Please execute these ideas. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think there's a couple of things I would point out on this. I certainly think that it's healthy and useful for parties and for those seeking elected office to advance ideas in the democratic arena. I think that's important. And I'm actually for parties being able to do that in more sophisticated ways, costing platforms, coming up with these ideas. I think that helps the democratic discourse and dialogue in a run-up to an election. And I think public servants who are watching elections and seeing these policy ideas are obviously preparing transition binders and starting to think about what this looks like in terms of policy and administration within government. But I think the challenge that you're noting around, do we look to our public service anymore as a place to provide policy ideas? Or are they really just a delivery arm or an implementation unit? And I think my answer would be, I think it's a mix of both. And going back to our Westminster kind of governance arrangement, some governments want to look to the public service and say, I need some ideas. Or nobody was talking about this issue when we first got elected, but now all of a sudden, everybody is talking about affordability. What are our issues, our options? So I think that the public service can be used for either. And I think at its best, it's used for both. But it needs to be responsive and look to the government of the day and say, what do they need to govern effectively? And how do we provide our considerations? Even if I don't like the government's idea, what is the information that they need and the advice that they need to ensure that they've thought it through and they appreciate what the consequences of their policy preference and implementation regime will be? But the only other point I would add to this is that I think that the move towards kind of more implementation in the public service is useful because they're also aware of kind of how to do things. And sometimes governments, of course, make announcements and campaign commitments and then come into government and realize, oh, this is a lot harder to actually to do and implement. So the public service has to play that role. Quintessentially, though, my view, linking back to the talk today, is that the public service has an obligation, in my view, to ensure that it has the capacity to provide ideas, as you called it, or policy options, policy designs for a government that's looking for them, or the capacity to implement whatever the government's preferences is. They need to be able to meet that suite of activity on both fronts. And so they need the capacity to be able to respond to whatever the stylistic preferences of a prime minister or a minister are.
So now that's the second word I was going to ask you to define, capacity, because capacity could mean volume, could mean flow through, could mean sophistication. What do you mean by capacity?
Yeah, well, this is an ongoing debate in the policy literature. So I gave a definition in the talk that was really about, the skills and competencies of governments to be able to advance policy ideas, policy designs, and make them real and implement them. I think the capacity conversation in the academic literature has really kind of broadened, much like policy has. I think the parallels between our discussions around what is policy and what is capacity are very tightly coupled, because they reflect the fact that it's not just about having someone in StatsCan or someone who's competent in quantitative and data and has significant analytical capacity. You also need the capacity within your organization to be able to couple that or marry that with the policy work that's happening with stakeholder views, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the notion of capacity is typically looked at in academic terms as the ability to execute and the requirements that exist at the dimension of the individual staff you have, the organization, and then kind of broader systems concerns around, the government of Canada exists within a broader system of international relations and the context of the day, and our Westminster parliamentary system. So all these features, I think, are relevant to how we think about capacity. But at the end of the day, it's much like the notion of an elephant. You know it when you see it, right? It's hard to describe. But I think that the point is, it's the ability of government to actually to do things. And what's interesting is that the conversations around capacity are now often also including those outside of government. So your think tank community, your consultants, international bodies. How able are various actors and various institutions to to provide what's needed to actually advance policy ideas and issues into concrete programs and services, and then execute on those and deliver those for whoever is the target population at the end of the day.
Now, if I had to take your talk and summarize it in one word, I'll give you my one word, and I'd like you to react to it. My one word would be simply professionalization. From what I heard you say, it's like the policy function in the federal government isn't as professionalized as it maybe could or should be. And you noted some of the things. There's kind of, and this really struck me in 1997 when I started in the policy world. Like there is no job category called, policy. There's job titles called policy analyst, but there's no job category.
Sure.
Most of us were slotted in, and myself included, were slotted into a category called economists. And as we know, economists take one view of the world. Generally speaking, it's a disciplinary view. But I think to me, a good policy analyst is somebody who's more multidisciplinary, whether that's anthropology, sociology, psychology, behavioral psychology, economics, etc. So kind of number one. Number two, you said something that I think would bring horror into the hearts of many people in Ottawa, which is we should actually test to see. I almost heard you say we should kind of audit our policy capacity. Did I hear you right?
Yeah. So my one word would be stewardship. I think that the point is policymaking is complicated. It's always been complicated. And if you go back and look, just to use your example of people coming in as economists, policy analysis was about cost benefits. It was about econometrics. It was about those types of skills. Now policy is also about consultations and negotiations and a variety of different activities that are part of what we would call modern policy work. And so I think the one word of stewardship for me and the emphasis in my talk was on stewardship, because the only way that we're going to be able to keep our finger on the fast moving beast that is policy is by being more introspective, being more thoughtful. I will never recommend the use of the word auditing, because I think that will draw the wrong types of people. I don't think it's an exercise in accountability or in gotcha. You have this, you don't have that. I think it's really just there are a variety of different ways in which we can get a better sense of where is that capacity in the organization to come up with ideas, design them, implement them. Where is it strongest? Where is it weakest? What do we need to do to address those types of issues and to do it in an ongoing way? I mean, the beautiful policy capacity report that was issued in the 1990s, in rereading it, it's still it's excellent work, and it resonates even today. And so I think that why do we need to wait 30 years to be doing that exercise? I mean, so much has happened. That was pre-internet, right? It's pre kind of a lot of things. And so I think having those types of reviews or stock takes or whatever you want to call it is really about just, like I use the analogy of going to the doctor's office. Is the public service capacity healthy? Where do we need investments? And crucially, I think governments have different preferences for how they use the public service. But all governments that are elected want it to be effective to do whatever it is that they want it to do. And so the public service has a responsibility as a steward to ensure that it's ready and it has the capacity to meet the different demands of various governments. So stewardship is a way to, I think it's, I give it a lot of thought, because I think you can train, you can develop new competencies and skills, and who knows what's coming 5 years down the road. But if we have a leadership in the public service at the senior levels, but also in departments and managers, and an approach that's really trying to think about how do we ensure that we're healthy and we're investing in ourselves in the right ways, that will bode well for Canadians and for the public service.
Now, when we talk policy inside the zoo, the major instrument in the federal public service for that is the memoranda to cabinet. That's the kind of the document that kind of gets stamped, where you say this policy idea has been approved, in some cases funded, in some cases, etc. In the olden days, this is even before I started in the government of Canada, I think this was up until the 70s. I don't remember exactly, but I should look it up one day. In the old days, we would kind of show our work from the policy community. And what I meant by that is the memorandum to cabinet had two very distinct parts. One that was the background part, which was here are the facts, here's what Australia is doing, here's what Americans are doing, here's what the demographic profile is in Canada, here's what's changing, here's what's coming the same. And then the last little part would be the recommendation, the advice. And my understanding of what the system was like at some point after the decision had been taken, not 30 years after the decision had been taken, but maybe 30 days after the decision had been taken, you would kind of metaphorically unstaple the two parts of the document. The advice would be hidden for 30 years, but the basis upon which that decision was taken was released publicly. And it was released publicly, I think, actually in the form of a white paper.
Okay.
Do you think that would help in the sense of kind of showing our work?
Yeah. So 2 points on this. The first would be that MCs or memorandums to cabinet, I always kind of see them as the pointy end of the spear. It's kind of, it's looking for permission, policy authority to do something. But it really reflects, as you pointed out, kind of a whole bunch of policy work that happens earlier. And so my view on kind of modernizing policymaking is not to emphasize too much the MC process. Sure, look at that. And I will note also that the MC template that's currently in use by the government isn't publicly available, to your second point. When they changed it in 2015, I asked for it.
Who told you that?
And never got it. And it's still not public. And I think that, to me, I always found that kind of problematic because if I'm in Wellington, let's say in New Zealand, their cabinet decisions and the minutes of cabinet meetings are publicly available, right? And so I think there's just a different culture towards how cabinet and its decision-making processes work in different jurisdictions. I mean, I think that's very far from where we're at. And I think that there are trade-offs and implications with that. But I do think that there is a benefit. The other example would be their long-term briefings initiative, where their deputy level equivalents are required by law to publish through Parliament long-term policy briefings on issues. So these aren't kind of what's happening today, but they're, let's take AI or take a big issue that's kind of happening, and they generate long-term briefings to inform Parliament. And so I think, and that's publicly available, the views and showing their work on what the considerations are. So I think in the Canadian case, are there opportunities to look at opening up things? I mean, I certainly know within the scholarly community, there's debate on the efficacy of having opened up mandate letters. Was that useful, or did that serve to kind of complicate governance for people in Ottawa or for Canadians or what have you? So I think you need to be careful when you open or close things from public view. But my approach has always been that transparency and sunshine are wonderful in a public policy context. But I do recognize and support the need for, trust-based exchanges of policy advice between senior officials and, ministers and prime ministers and cabinets who are trying to sort through complicated policy issues. So I think to a degree, but I'm not sure that just opening everything up to the public would necessarily serve a purpose. My first principle here would be, to what end? Why are we doing this? What utility is it serving?
No, this isn't a red thing or a blue thing or an orange thing or a purple thing or a green thing. But in Canada, we have a strong executive. And that executive is, I think it continues to be very much stronger than it was and is in our Commonwealth cousins or our Westminster cousins. Is that part and parcel of the conversation that we're having here, that kind of having a policy community, a policy capacity, in some ways favors the executive? Because if you have a strong parliament, by definition, the executive, I think, is weakened relative to speaking. In Canada, the relationship between parliament or the legislature and the executive is very different from most democratic countries. I mean, there are a lot of people that say there are like dictators that don't have the powers that our democratically elected executive have.
Yeah, I think we're seized in Canada with this concept and this discussion around the concentration of power in prime minister's offices and at the center of government. I think those discussions are warranted. The problem is that as soon as you start having discussions about that, it sucks all the oxygen out of the broader question of how well our capacity and our policymaking systems and processes are working. I think that having a strong political executive in the Canadian case has its merits, in the sense of, if you look at other places where there's so much more turbulence because of the weak center in the United Kingdom, or the repeated leadership spills that happen in Australia and, the United Kingdom, also lots of leadership changes. What you see from a turbulent center of government is that there's all these resets and not much gets done. I think that having a concentration of power at the center of government in Canada is a product of trying to govern in a really large federated public administration system, not a federal kind of country, but as well in a federated public administration where you've got all these different departments doing all these different kinds of things. That the tendency to want to centralize is really an attempt to try and add coherence and coordination around everything that's happening at the same time. I think that it's problematic in other ways, and we want to make sure that ministers and deputies and other appropriate processes are in place that can inform that policymaking process. But I am of the view that the center cannot do everything. And indeed, I think, part of the discussion around looking at the role of, let's say, the clerk and as DM to the prime minister, as well as secretary to cabinet and head of the public service, they're going through this conversation in the UK right now. A former minister in the center of government came out with recommendations on how to strengthen their center of government. Think tanks are seized with the distribution of authorities and powers amongst the different actors at the center of government, in part because there's a sense that they're doing too much. And so I'm of the view that a lot of policy work is happening that the center of government is not unaware of, but is not necessarily as concerned with, because it's not a mandate issue or a government priority or what have you. That policy work is still important. And maybe tomorrow that's going to be something that the center of government or a minister or cabinet wants information and policy work on. So again, I take a kind of a more macro view that you need to support our cabinet and our prime minister to govern collegially in an effective way. But you also need, as head of public service, to be thinking about what's happening in global affairs or happening in transport, happening in agriculture. Those policy issues and policy files and capacity need to be nurtured as well.
Now, my last question is, and I want to close on this in terms of a question. You came and visited our zoo, so to speak, and you looked around the public service. What's the role of your zoo in this? And your zoo happens to be schools of public administration, schools of political science. I think you're formerly affiliated with Monk, which is a little bit of a think tank. What's the role of those things outside of the government of Canada and outside the public service of Canada to help inform? Is it the generation of ideas? Is it training people? Is it being provocative? What's the role of your zoo?
Yeah, those all sound great. I think maybe a mixed bag of that. I do, my talk was really centered around what the public service could do and some options for them to think about for renewal and modernization. But I'm keenly aware that the community of public administration scholars thinking about and working on these issues is rather small in Canada. I think it's small internationally as well. But I do think that there's been some great recommendations by colleagues in Policy Options magazine recently around kind of options for reform and things, and a debate around kind of royal commissions versus task forces that I think is helpful. But I see our review as a bit of all of that. I mean, fundamentally, it's to do empirical research to help edify and inform kind of the view of what's happening, providing some objectivity, providing kind of a different view on what's going on. I also see the benefit of comparison. As a scholar who spends a lot of time in the UK and New Zealand and Australia, they are wrestling with similar issues. Their cultures and their reform pathways and their institutions are all different. And so I think that provides us insights on what's possible, but also gives us a chance to reflect on ourselves and to say, what's unique about the Canadian case? What do we need to be thinking about now? So I'm in favor of kind of all hands on deck, more folks thinking about what's going on in these big questions inside government, outside of government. And I've certainly appreciated the opportunity to be the visiting scholar here at the school. And one of the things I did was bring in other scholars and try and make connections with public servants through some events. So I think I'm bullish. I think there's lots of opportunity, and it's just about trying to be thoughtful and comprehensive and taking that first step towards more stewardship.
I can't say this enough. Public policy matters. Public policy is what we do as a collective, whether that's at the municipal level, the provincial level, the national level, or the supranational level. But policy at the end of the day is what makes us live well or not well in civilized collective communities. And Professor Jonathan Kraft is one of the brightest lights in the Canadian public policy and public administration space. Thank you so much for your time as the 2024 Jocelyn Bergon Visiting Scholar at the Canada School of Public Service. And thank you for your provocative speech to end your tenure at that role.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.